In the tale of Hanes Taliesin, the history of Taliesin, the aforementioned prophet and bard is born via a complex tale featuring transformation, a mother's love and fury, and divine inspiration, the very spirit of Awed. A core theme one could glean from the very essence of this enigmatic folktale is the concept of initiation. Ceridwen, goddess of inspiration in Welsh Celtic tradition, is viewed by many witches and magical practitioners today as an initiatrix. She who opens the doorway for us to traverse upon an initiatory journey of self-empowerment and self-discovery. At heart, an initiatory journey within a magical context is a process of metaphorical death and rebirth. We shed ourselves of our past perceptions of who we are and enter into a new phase, one of illumination and power. Initiation is not just grandiose ceremonial rituals within witching covens. A process of initiation could also simply be an experience which leads you to a new way of thinking, of living, and of being. Welcome, Croeso, to the Welsh Witch Podcast, our first ever episode. My name is mhara.starling. I am a Welsh witch who was born in North Wales and grew up on Ynys Môn, the Isle of Anglesey. My magical practice and spiritual pathway is deeply informed and inspired by the spirits, lore, and magic of the landscape upon which I was raised. This podcast aims to explore various facets of the continuum of Welsh magic and witchcraft. Some weeks I will be interviewing folks who traverse the Welsh continuum of magic, paganism, or of folklore and mythology in their day-to-day lives. Other weeks I will simply speak to you alone, sharing some of my favourite folk tales, delving into folk magical practices, and exploring an element of modern witchcraft inspired by the magic of Wales. This week, I am absolutely delighted to welcome the one and only Kristoffer Hughes onto the podcast. Kristoffer is a dear friend of mine. I have known him since I was a teenager, and he was, and still very much is, a key figure in my life who inspires and informs my practice in such visceral ways. Kristoffer also grew up in North Wales and, like me, is a native Welsh speaker. He lives on the Isle of Anglesey today and is the chief of the Anglesey Druid Order. Beyond that, he is an author of books such as Ceridwen, Celtic Goddess of Inspiration, and As the Last Leaf Falls. He is also a death professional and a drag artist, among so many other wonderful things, a truly multifaceted individual, a marvellous and deeply interesting pagan who I am proud to call a friend. Back in 2012 or so, I contacted the Anglesey Druid Order and asked for help in figuring out how to navigate paganism within our locale. I wanted information about local gatherings, open rituals, or classes and such that might be going on, and it was Kristoffer who answered my email, and lo and behold, he lived not too far away from me, just a short drive down the road. And so I hopped off the bus outside his cottage and I went to have a chat with him, and we spoke for hours about Welsh Celtic paganism, druidry, witchcraft, and so much more. There would be many more days like that one in future, where I would pop to Kristoffer's to have some tea and a natter. He guided me when I was writing my first book, and I am proud to call him not only a friend, but an inspirational mentor and teacher. In this episode, Kristoffer and I sat down to have a chat about the ways in which we can find Welsh magic. Finding Welsh Magic is the name of this podcast episode, and during this episode we'll talk about how we got into paganism and witchcraft, how one might find a Welsh stream of magical practice, and so many more wonderfully delicious things. We recorded this episode in Kristoffer's backyard, and so you might hear the sounds of the countryside in the background, from birdsong and breeze to tractors and maybe even some noises that sounds like gardening. Regardless, it's a fabulous chat, and I think it will help anyone setting out to formulate a path that is inspired by the magic of Wales. And so, without further ado, allow me to welcome Kristoffer onto the show as we discuss finding Welsh magic. Hello, Kristoffer. How are you doing today?
I'm really good, thank you, on this gorgeous sunny day.
Gosh, it is gorgeous.
It's beautiful.
For those of you who are listening or watching at home, we're sat in a caravan in Chris's back garden and we're looking out towards the fields, and it's actually a glorious spring day.
And the reason we're in my caravan is because my office is a little bit close to the road and there's some tractors trundling down occasionally.
So, Chris, thank you so much for agreeing to come chat with me. I know that I name drop you all the time when I'm doing podcast interviews, so I thought, who better to have on the first episode of the show than you? And of course, this is like the first time I'm doing a podcast, so bear with me as I'm getting used to how to go about it. I'm sure you've been interviewed by people who are far more professional than me. But for people who might be listening who don't know much about you, who might just know about you through your books or such, can you maybe give us a little introduction to who Chris is and what you do and what exactly your path is within paganism?
Okay, wow, that's a big question. That is. So predominantly, I'm just your average Welsh person who lives here on the island of Anglesey. I come from northwest Wales. My family are bilocated, either on the mainland in Snowdonia, and my mum's side will come from Ynys Môn, from Anglesey. So this entire landscape has always informed not only my personality, but later it would define my spiritual personality and identity as well. And it's something that has come from the ground up, I guess, because I always felt that there was something about the world that was intrinsically magical, but I didn't have a name for that as a child. But I loved having the opportunity to spend time by myself in the woods, although that makes me sound as if I didn't have any friends. But it wasn't quite like that. It was, I would make sure that I'd have time with my trees, with my woodland, and then I'd meet my friends a little bit later on. So my entire worldview orientated itself around my landscape. So when I started exploring spirituality, because nobody in my family was interested in spirituality at all. My mother's idea of spirituality is shand kid wallpaper at £250 a roll. That's about it, really. So the only avenue was Christianity, and that didn't quench a thirst. It didn't cut through what I needed. And then as I grew, as I developed, I realized that what I needed was always here. It had always been here. It was directly underneath my feet. So I started to explore what I guess is Celtic paganism in all its guises, from the very first book that I ever found was a book by Scott Cunningham, who wrote for Llewellyn Worldwide in the very early days. And I think he's been deceased since about 1992, 1993 maybe. So he was writing books in the 80s, and I came across a copy of one of his books called Magical Herbalism. And I still have that book, and I still love that book because it's reminiscent of a period in my life where all of that was very new and very exciting. And what he was talking about, I could sense and I could feel here in my land. So I started to develop my practice from people like Scott Cunningham and other people who inspired me at the time, until I discovered who I was in relation to my culture, my land, my heritage, and my ancestry. So of course, for the last 30 years, I've described my path to be that of a druid. But that's a fairly loaded term as well, because a lot of people don't necessarily understand maybe what that even means. Because people might think that we're very different from witches, but we're not really that different from witches, especially when you consider that Druidry and Wicca, the fathers of modern Druidry and modern Wicca, were very good friends. Ross Nichols and Gerald Gardner, they were both members of the Universal Bond, a Druid organisation. So there's this similarity of origin, there's a similarity of birth, there's a commonality of birth in both those traditions. And I've always incorporated magic into my my Druidry. So what I would describe myself as a polytheist, meaning that I perceive the divine to have many different faces and that they exist within the natural world and can be representations of deeper powers than just the natural world as well. But I primarily identify myself as a magical practitioner. I practice magic and I transcend the ordinary reality by magical techniques. But the devotional part of my practice is very much entrenched in Druidism or Druidry. And I would describe that as a devotional practice. And it's almost, I don't know whether it's the right word because I find the word somewhat provocative, but I guess that's almost the religiosity of my practice is Druidry, so that it's held within this Celtic worldview. And I have this profound love for my culture and particularly my language. And I think that's what I feel is fundamentally expressed through my Druidry in a devotional sense. But I also like getting down and dirty in the grove, in the woods over yonder, and doing magic and being a magical practitioner. That's always the cornerstone of my practice.
If you don't mind me saying so, just because I've already mentioned that I tend to name drop you a little every time I'm doing an interview and such. When people ask me, how did I get started into paganism and witchcraft, I always tell this story about how I found a little book in a charity shop called Spells for Teenage Witches, and how I was influenced and inspired by the land that I was in and the people that were surrounding me, including my grandmother who used to read tea leaves and such. So magic was always around me. But whenever I'm asked, how did you really get into this? I always say, well, everything really unfolded in front of me after I met you. And we met when I was a teenager.
Yeah.
Still quite young, quite formative years. And I remember sending an email to the Anglesey Druid Order at the time.
Yeah,
that was who I thought I was emailing, just the Anglesey Druid Order, this body of people. And you answered back and you said, where are you from? Aberfrau? I'm down the road. It was great. I got off the bus and I came to your house and we sat and I just quizzed you on all things to do with paganism and witchcraft. And you presented to me a witchcraft, or paganism specifically, that was rooted here in where we are. And that was something I hadn't come across yet. That wasn't something that was apparent in the books that I'd read so far or in the things that I'd done so far. I was very much sitting there at home reading about, manifestation magic and connecting to the gods of Egypt and things like that, and reading about the Wiccan Rede and all this. And then I came to you and you introduced me to Ceridwen and Rhiannon and Aranrod, and I was like, I know these people, I know these characters. They were so important to my life growing up. I remember going to watch plays and reading books and such to do with them in school. And you introduced me to this idea that they're more than just characters and stories in Wales, that they can be quite intrinsically linked to our spirituality and religion. And for that I've always been deeply thankful to you. And every time I hear you talk about it, I can sense that deep connection to the land and to this place here and now. And that's something that I've always kind of tried to take inspiration from you. I need to be rooted here and now. And it was something that you and both our mutual friend Julie also taught me, because Julie was someone that was also there a lot, and she was also very, you need to get out, get to a burial chamber on the side of the beach and get to work. So I guess another question I have for you is, how exactly did you start? I know you say that it's always been a part of your life and that it's always been here with you and part of the land, but was there any kind of specific initiatory moments that made you think, oh yeah, that person led me to this, or this book led me to... I know you said Cunningham already, but I'm just wondering if there are any experiences that you had that really pushed you down this path.
Yes, there was. There was one a pivotal moment in my life. In my late teens, I'd gone down to explore the Judeo-Christian tradition, because that was about the only expression of spirituality that was openly available here. And that didn't work. And I found that I had this crisis, and I guess a crisis of faith, even though my faith was wavering in that tradition anyway. I wasn't fully invested. but I didn't know what I was supposed to do. So I took myself off into the mountains. I was staying with my father at the time on the mainland in a little village called Llanberis. And I took myself up into the hills, and it was in the pitch of night, in the depth of night. And I found myself suddenly, there's a river that runs from the mountains into the village of Llanberis called Afon Hwch, or the River of the Sow. And it's full of mythologies and stories and legends, and some of them entertaining and funny and some quite horrifying. And I found myself at one particular pool called Pwll Morwyn, or the Maiden's Pool, which is very, very dark. And everybody has been warned off from going anywhere near Pwll Morwyn because it's extremely dangerous, and people have drowned there. And the myth is that a maiden had drowned in these waters. And I suddenly found myself on this stony ledge, gazing out over this water, which was inky black. And the reason it's dangerous is because it's in a V-shaped gully. So if you jump in, you're likely to get your limbs trapped in the very narrow bottom of this inky deep pool. And there's gnarly oak trees that grow out of the rocks, and they're clinging for dear life onto the rocks, and they completely conceal this pool from the sky. So it's always very dark, and it was the dead of night. And I suddenly felt somewhat anxious, thinking, oh my word, I'm at Pwll Morwyn. This is dangerous. I shouldn't be here. But I was also quite upset because I didn't know what was happening to me or what I should be doing with my spirituality. And then I suddenly saw in the moonlight and the starlight the immense beauty of that place. It was so incredibly beautiful. And there was a tangibility to it. It had a personality that I suddenly felt as if we'd demonized it and turned it into a place that was bad. And at that precise moment, I saw the inherent magic of its own unique personality. And I think I understood anyway that water is attracted to water. And so the water in that pool is reaching out to the water in me, and I was crying, and there was snot coming out of my nose, and it was a dreadful mess. And suddenly these two beings met, and the two beings were me and that place. And it was like a switch went off inside of me at that precise moment, and I realized that what I'd been searching for was here. It was right here. It was under my feet, and it was within me. And all of this searching, and I've often heard since, people searching, and they've climbed mountains in Tibet or halfway up the Himalayas for someone to say, that which you are searching for is within you. And you think, oh God, Doreen Valiente could have told me that for $5.99, So it was just there, and it was that moment. And then a little bit further on from that, I met a friend called Myfanwy, who lived in the coastal North Wales town of Rhyl. And she was my inspiration, my human inspiration. She was the one who taught me to see the magic that was here. And the thing that struck me with her was that she always reminded me to keep reminding myself that throughout my magical life, to remember that the function of magic or spirituality is to root you in a place so that you can grow rooted. When people go searching for things, and they go searching in distant places, or they go searching way beyond themselves, I think then that they're unable to rise rooted because the roots aren't in their square mile. And whilst you can be inspired by, I've been to Egypt 4 times, I love all of that mythology, but my roots are here, and the branches reach out to those distant inspirational places. But I think first and foremost, the most important thing is that we rise rooted from where we are, from what we can feel the most, and that there's a delicious magic in that.
I know that you are the chief of the Anglesey Druid Order, and I'm a druid, but I've always also seen you as a witch as well.
Well, yes, and I think it's a misperception and also a misconception that because I would hasten to guess that probably 50% of the Anglesey Druid Order's members would also consider themselves to be practicing witches. And then others might not, or they might use the word occasionally. But I practice Swyn Gyfaredd in the Welsh language, which is the craft of enchantment as a possible translation, a loose translation. But magic and the practice of folk magic and even ritual magic, because I am a bit of a fan of ritual magic and I've studied the Kabbalah and other Hermetic stuff. But my love is for the simple. Well, no, even to say simple might sound almost as if it's derogatory, but I don't mean it to mean derogatory, but I like being in the woods, in the grove, doing and practicing my magic.
Yes.
And they're not necessarily accompanied by the bangs and whistles of ritual ceremonial magic, but to me it's the thing that pulled and drew me to this particular tradition. And Druidry is my spirituality. My practices are very much centred around magic and witchcraft.
I'm wondering if, as somebody who's been practising for probably a little longer than I have,
About 30 years.
how would you personally, if somebody came to you, just like I did that day, if somebody hopped off a bus, came to your front door and said, Chris, help me, I really want to begin a practice that is rooted in Welsh Celtic paganism. Where do I start? What would be your initial pieces of advice to them?
So initially, I think you would look for the stories that help to transmit and preserve those particular traditions. And we're lucky enough here in Wales and in other regions of the world as well to have those particular sets of stories. And they're relatively easy to get at nowadays with, even the digital mirrors at the University Library of Wales. They have so many resources, and second-hand bookshops or even just a general Google search will bring about a hoard of Welsh mythological material. And I think initially that we look to story and legend for inspiration for magical practice, because I think that records something from a time that is distant enough that technology wasn't impeding it, and that the mythologies of Wales in particular, they do record a period of time just before the Romans got here. And when you read those stories, you can tell that the Romans are nearby, but they haven't yet arrived. So it's capturing a moment in time. But at the same time, I think I always consider that mythology is the legend of the gods, and that legend is the mythology of humankind. So when we look to the vernacular, to stories that are rooted right in the locale itself, we can glean more inspiration when it comes to magical practice. Because I think we can lose sight of so much if we only focus on mythology, because mythology can seem too big, it can seem too large, that when we break it down to local vernacular or colloquial folk magic, we can be inspired as to how our ancestors did things, or what they might have believed the natural world to represent, or how they believed magic worked, and that we take that inspiration and we transplant it into the modern day. Because I think that if we try and copy things from the past, I don't think it ever works. I think we have to keep dreaming new myths into being, so that if somebody is interested in Welsh magical practice in particular, that they look to the past for sources of inspiration, but that they also look to the people who are actually practicing it today, and to ask those people, well, how do you incorporate it into your life, and what does it give your life? I mean, to me personally, it brings to my life the most joy and meaning that I long for, and in all of my magical work, I always look for meaning, not just for transformation, that it does something to me, that it transforms me on a powerful level, and that ultimately it's the landscape and the language that records the elements of Welsh magic and Welsh folk magic in particular, and that there's so much that's held in the language. Whenever people might say, oh gosh, does that mean I have to learn a little Welsh? Well, the truth to that is yes, a little. Just have a go. I mean, there's things like Duolingo where you can do these things for free and capture enough to be able to use some words, because the important thing about the words in relation to magic is that whenever we're speaking a Welsh chant or an incantation or an invocation, we speak with the voices of the dead. And that, the belief in Welsh magical tradition is that language has an animistic principle. It's alive. So that when we speak these words, we're not just speaking passively, we're stepping into a current and into a stream that is culturally magic and culturally magical, and that we get carried along in that stream. So I think the definition of a Welsh witch or a Welsh druid or a Welsh magical practitioner isn't in what they believe, it's in what they do.
I wanted to highlight something that you said to me a few years ago that was really impactful to my practice. And I remember you talking about the fact that many aspects of your practice help you transform your anxiety into joy. And I'm wondering if you can maybe touch upon that, because I don't think I could repeat your words in the way that you can. But I remember sitting, I think we were in your car and we were driving somewhere, and I was talking to you about my anxieties about, for example, when I'm surrounded by other pagans, sometimes I still feel that anxiety about talking about magic, because we still live in a world where it's almost told, we're told, that our beliefs are silly and strange, and I still hold that concept of like, oh gosh, are these people going to think I'm some kind of lunatic, which I am, but, I get paranoid about what people are going to think. And I remember saying that to you, and you told me about how druidry, in the same way that like other aspects of your life, such as drag and your magical practice as well, they help you transform your anxieties into joy and into good things that can help you propel you forward. And I think that matches with what you were saying about how it needs to change you as well.
Yes, very much so. I think a magical practitioner who doesn't utilize the current of magic for self-transformation is missing out on a whole horde of transformative inspiration that can profoundly affect their living and their lives, which in turn affects the rest of the world. And in the Welsh tradition, we have this principle of Prader. So if you look to Welsh mythology, and particularly the 4 branches of the Mabinogi that we use as cornerstones, not just in Welsh Druid practice, but also in Celtic paganism in general and Welsh magic, you'll find that the most effective way of connecting to the archetypes that decorate that landscape is to see yourself as the 3 primary archetypes that move within that landscape, so that you can see that they're not describing something that happened in the deep past. They're describing something that happens to you in this second. So essentially a body of mythology is something that has never happened, but they happen all the time. And they're happening because we're a part of them. So one of the archetypes within Welsh mythology is Pryderi, the son or the offspring of Rhiannon and Pwyll. And Pryderi basically just means separation anxiety, disenchantment, worry, stress. It means all of these things, which are an inherent aspect of the human condition. And essentially what it's describing is that when we're born, the entire universe just responds to us. We cry and the breast is brought to us in comfort and succor. And then as we grow up, we become anxious and we start to look for ourselves in others. So there's this whole concept then of I and other, and we start to lose track of where we were, and anxiety is self-promulgating then at that point. And I still get anxious, and I think that any form of magical practice or spiritual practice is about continuously looking at all of the mechanisms that cause your anxiety to escalate and become something more than it should be. So I consider my druidry, my magic, my drag, because I'm a drag artist as well, to all be mechanisms by which I transform my anxieties into joy. And part of that comes from the fact that I can't cure all of the sorrows in the world, or in my life even, but I can choose to live joyously. But there are times where people don't like that. And I think the reason, to use another mythological allegory, the third personality in the Mabinogi is a character called Llew, which again is a non-gendered noun and adjective and verb. That means light. It just means light. So that when we become joyous and when we live within our own streams of joy, we shine. But sometimes people will give you what for that and ask you to dim your light. And it's like, no. You're going to have to put on some shades, because I'm not dimming my light, because it comes from a place of joy, and so that tenet is really important to me, that whatever is happening in my life, whether it's bad, good, or indifferent, I try and find ways to transform it into a joyous representation of the universe itself, which is what we are. And that's what my magic is primarily used for, to change me. Because if I can't be changed, I can't change the world external to me, unless I can affect me and where I am in it. And then I'm more likely to be able to let them eat it.
One thing I've always wanted to ask you in more depth about is polytheism, and specifically Welsh polytheism within the cultural context of Wales, and how we utilise and almost build our relationship to the gods of this place, because the gods of this place are quite complicated sometimes, especially if we're talking about them in like an academic sense. And even I get stumped. I've already said to a few people that I'm not the best person to come to if we're going to talk about polytheism or gods, and I'm often running to you. I'm sure you're sick of me by now, because I run to you and I'm like, Chris, what's going on with this? Like, explain it to me. And one of those questions is always like, are they really gods? Because that's one of the conversations that goes on. It's there are some academics and such who will turn around and say, well, these characters are not gods. They are just characters from stories, and they don't originate from anything other than the medieval period when these stories were written down. And then you have other people who say, no, they're echoes of something older. And I'm just wondering if I could ask you to talk a little bit about what it means to be in reverence of the gods that we associate with Wales nowadays, gods such as Rhiannon, Ceridwen, Lleu, Gwydion, all these characters that can be found within the Mabinogi that are now celebrated and honoured by modern-day pagans, and how exactly they might fit into a magical practice as well. So, two big questions there, I know. But basically what I'm asking is, how do you view the gods, and how do you view your life as a polytheist, and how does it influence your magical practice?
So it's very much a huge influence in my practice. It defines so much of my practice. But also, there's a lot there to unpack as well, because academia is always very interested in criticising people for polytheistic approach to mythology. But at the same time, academia is not in the best position to offer commentary on the validity of deities, because that's not their role. Their role is the study of linguistics and the study of culture through mythological processes. When you connect to something from a spiritual platform, your entire approach is vastly different to an academic. And also within academia, there's a propensity for them to not appreciate the power of apotheosis. So to a theologian, you'd have a very different argument from a theologian, because they understand the principle of apotheosis, or to make a god. So even the predominant uber being in the revealed religions here in the United Kingdom would be Jehovah and the Nazarene, Jesus Christ. But we also understand that the beginnings of those particular deific representations were apotheoetic. They were created by apotheosis. Yahweh was essentially just a tree spirit to begin with, who became something bigger. And then when Rome got hold of it, it became something different again. So it's always changing and transforming itself to the needs of the people. So whilst in Welsh mythology, we can see these echoes of ancient deities from the Iron Age era, from the old golden age of the Celts. So people like Rhiannon is cognate with Rhigantona, the great queen, Teirnon with Tiganonos, Lleu with Lugh, and there's a whole horde of them that have echoes. But I think as well that people can be remiss when they refer to them simply as Celtic gods, because Rhiannon and Ceridwen and Pwyll and Gwydion, they're Welsh gods. They're Cymraeg gods. They're the gods of Cymru, because we've essentially made them the gods that we need in the 21st century, and we were using them in the 20th century as well and working with them, that we've taken these concepts and we've given them deific life. But the fact that they still survive implies that there's a narrative spirit, that there's an inherent animistic principle within them themselves that have caused them to goroesi. What's that in English? To goroesi, to survive the ages, and so to me, the gods, so some people might be soft polytheists, where they consider the gods sort to be aspects of maybe one larger power or elements of nature. And then there's hard polytheists who believe them to have their own agencies. There are others who take a euhemeristic approach or an animistic approach, and I kind of combine all of those. I perceive that someone like Ceridwen is a hard polytheistic principle. She is a deity with her own agency. She doesn't live in our world. She exists somewhere else. But whereas Rhiannon, I've worked with Rhiannon a lot as a death service professional because of her psychopompic quality and the fact that she was a calumniated woman who was grieving the loss of a child. So when I work with Rhiannon in that case, I'm not necessarily working with her as a hard polytheistic principle, but maybe as an archetype that represents these powers. But I can appreciate the hard polytheistic nature of Rhiannon as well. So my definition of the gods is always changing depending on how I'm working with them. And I work with a lot of them. I have a lot of deities. And sometimes, so I have daily prayers to Ceridwen Morn and Llyr in particular, because Llyr, or the god of the sea, is surrounding us on an island. So they always form part of my daily practice. But the family tree of gods that I work with are a bit like my family. They have specialities. If I want somebody to help my husband put up the shed, I'm not going to call my mother. I'm going to call my stepfather. So I have a similar relationship with my deities. I'm not devoted entirely to just one. We have a family tree. And they each have a role within my spiritual practice. But when people say there was no evidence of any cults to these gods, there were no shrines, there were no altars, my initial answer to that is that's actually not a correct analysis of the Welsh bardic tradition or Welsh culture. Because the bards, whilst they didn't necessarily identify someone like Ceridwen as a goddess, and there was a reason they didn't identify her as a goddess, because people had no concept. People couldn't conceptualize that which they had no concept of. So to them, she was inherently, she was a spiritual principle, almost like a muse. But the fact that there are no shrines or altars in the Welsh tradition, there were shrines and altars, and they were the lips of the bards. It was the bards who kept them alive. And now when people will often criticize Celtic pagans and say, oh, none of these were gods in the past, why did there have to be? Because Yahweh wasn't a god 4,000 years ago, and neither was Allah. None of them were. They didn't even exist in the same manner that they exist today. They don't need to be. They're not substantiated by the past. They're substantiated by the manner in which we develop relationship with them today. And by the power of apotheosis, we can create any deity to serve a need in humanity that might reflect a need within that principle's desire to be venerated or to be worked with, in a particular way. So my relationship with them is a bit like this. It's always up and down and changing and morphing, just like the relationships I have with humans.
This whole concept of being stuck in the past, that a lot of, not just within the pagan community, but also within like the witchcraft community as a whole, like people can, I think, sometimes be very stuck in trying to recreate something from long, long ago and ignoring the here and now. And I see that a lot in Celtic spaces. And I talk a lot about like how people, especially people who aren't from the Celtic nations today, they tend to romanticize these places and make them out to be some far off mystical land where we're hunting will-o'-the-wisps with Merida in the fog. And it's almost like they don't see us as real people here and now. So I really love that you bring the here and now into your practice. And speaking of the here and now, you are the chief of the Anglesey Druid Order. So you had the Druid Order and you had their rituals and such, and I have always looked at the Druid Order with such admiration, and I tried to attend all the open rituals and such when I lived here. And I was wondering if you could give us a little insight into how does the Druid Order function in a magical sense, because I wanted to talk more specifically about magic right now.
Yeah.
How did the Anglesey Druid Order incorporate magic into their beliefs?
We very much incorporate magic, and we're often criticised as being very witchy in our druidry, which we're quite happy to own. Which is I shall own that. Thank you very much. We'll take that as a compliment. And if you look to our past, if you turn round to Marth or Gwydion and accuse them of being witchy in their druidry, I think they'd probably think twice if they were smacked over the top of the head with one of their wands, because they were very much magical practitioners. And so much of it comes from being rooted in the here and now, like you were just saying, because I didn't want the Anglesey Druid Order to be something that was trying to recreate a past, because that's futile. Because ultimately the language that we both speak, if we were sent back by some time machine to 2,000 years ago, within 30, 40 minutes or so, we'd be able to converse with the ancient Druids of Anglesey, because we share the same tongue. We share a commonality of language. But that doesn't mean that I can reconstruct anything. I can't reconstruct anything from 2,000 years ago for two reasons. We don't know what they did and how they did it. And I wouldn't want to, because I'm a druid and magical practitioner of the 21st century. And what I practice has its roots in the past, but its branches are very much in the here and now. So within the Anglesey Druid Order, people will come to our school. So the course lasts a year, and during that year they come to the school 4 times, and they stay in a little residential bubble, which I love, because they step out of mundanity and they step into a magical environment where magic is not only encouraged but practiced fully, so that we learn about the gods and we learn about the Celticity of our practice and the devotional component, which you would, I guess, place in the druid box, with a little ribbon and a label on it. But then when we're out in the landscape, we're practicing magic that transforms the practitioner. So all of the magic that we practice, which has a theme that runs through every single weekend, and the homework that they do as well, is to tap into the magical persona that lives within you, and to encourage it and to nurture it to come out and be that magical person in the world. Because we live in a fairly disenchanted world. And I think as magical practitioners, we have 2 duties. The first is to re-enchant the world. And the first way we do that is by re-enchanting ourselves. And our second duty is to seed the future with wisdom. And that ultimately a witch, a druid, a heathen, an occultist, our job is to be wise, and is to try and seed that wisdom, so that future generations will look back and think, she was a really good witch. She's left a legacy of power, empowerment, of ability, of tenacity and energy and vibrancy. And, she was a good druid. They were a good heathen, because they've seeded our present with their wisdom. And I think that only comes from not talking and studying magic, which are essential in themselves, but doing it, of actually doing it and being transformed by the process. And that whatever magic we do ultimately also transforms the originator, and every time we do it, we become just that more magical in the hope that we enchant the world. And I think that's our job. I think that's the job of any magical practitioner, because otherwise it's kind of like, well, what's the point? And to me, that's the point. The point is I always think that I can tell when a person is a truly gets down and dirty magical practitioner, because they crackle. There's this crackle to them, and there's something in their personality. There's just this crackle, and I don't know what other word I can use to describe it. There's just this in them. Yeah. There's just something there. And when I'm in the company of those people, I feel inspired and I feel empowered by their empowerment. And I've met so many of those people, and I'm lucky to know so many of those people, yourself included, who crackle, with a magical quality. And that quality kept to oneself is futile, but when shared, it makes other people crackle. And that changes the world, which sounds very grand.
I think inspiration is such a core tenet of what we do as Welsh practitioners, calling to the Awen, singing the Awen, living the Awen every day is something that we do. And I remember when I first started putting myself out there, somebody asked me, why do you do that? Why do you put yourself out there? Why do you post on social media? Why do you write books? What's the purpose? And I said, honestly, the biggest motivation I have is because I want to inspire someone. Because I remember how influential and inspirational people like you, people like Julie, people that I've met at witch fests and camps and such were to me growing up. I wanted to be that to someone.
Yes,
and
yes.
It's it's surreal sometimes when people do get in touch now and say, you inspired me to really dig deeper into these practices. And it's almost like, oh wow, I didn't expect it to happen this quickly. But it's happening. And I think, you're right in that our job is to get out there and actually plant those seeds, get yourself in a position where you're inspiring others and enchanting the world again. And I think we're going to have to stop there because we've been talking for nearly an hour.
Is it?
I could ask you... I could continue to ask you so many questions, and I will in future episodes if you'll come back.
Yes. Always up for it.
Oh, brilliant. Well, thank you so much for talking to us today. Do you have any last words of imparting wisdom to give?
Oh, of imparting wisdom. Oh my gosh, that puts me on the spot now, doesn't it? Have I used them all up in the last hour, I wonder?
There were a lot of good words used.
I think ultimately that it sounds a bit of a cliche, I suppose, but energy will always flow where your intention goes. Always. It will always flow in that particular direction. And I think that any magical practitioner needs to constantly look for the things that inspire them, so that the symbiotic flow of inspiration is continuously moving, always, all the time moving, and that the best magical practitioners are those who are constantly in the flow of what we would call in the Welsh tradition the Awen. The blessed holy breath of the universe blows through you. And and we get to do that here, and we express that obviously through a Welsh cultural continuum. But of course people express that wherever they are in the world, and can also use the wonder of Welsh magic to colour and decorate their own practice. But keep the energy moving, keep it flowing, so that you're always in the stream, you're always in the current of Awen.
What a absolutely wonderful chat. I just want to extend a sincere thank you to Kristoffer for coming onto the show and for gracing us with his knowledge and wisdom. If you'd like to learn more about Kristoffer, you can find links to his social media, to the books that he writes, to the website detailing all sorts of things about the Anglesey Druid Order, wherever you found this podcast episode. So wherever you saw this podcast episode shared at, I will be sharing the links, as well as on my social media pages whilst advertising this podcast episode. So if finding Kristoffer is something you'd like to do, go check that out, and I very much recommend you do. And thank you as well. Thank you for tuning in today and listening to the Welsh Witch Podcast, my first ever episode. I hope you enjoyed. Do let me know your thoughts, and I hope I see you in the next episode. See you very, very soon. Bendithion swynol. Magical blessings upon you all.